Workplace Toolkit. My name is Scott Dill, and I'm on the business development team here at Real Story Group. Our company founder, Tony Byrne, will be joining us on the line momentarily. As we get started, just a couple quick housekeeping items of note. If you do have questions throughout the presentation, you can enter those in the questions tab on the GoToMeeting, and we'll either get to those during the session or right at the very end. Also, for those attending, you will get a copy of the slides sent over to you within the next couple days. And for subscribers on the line, you'll be able to access a recording of the presentation in your library. So just for those that are new to Real Story Group, just as a quick introduction, we are fundamentally an industry analyst firm. Okay, so our main purpose is to help our customers select the technology that's going to be the right fit for their particular needs. And how we do this is a couple of different ways. First, we offer interactive tools where you can actually build a customized shortlist that's based on your specific scenarios, as well as your strategic considerations and goals. And then it's going to come up with a quadrant that's a little bit more dynamic than some of the static snapshots that you see out in the marketplace. And it's going to really narrow down which vendor is going to be the right fit for what you're looking to do. We also offer a product called Real Score, where you can benchmark the effectiveness of your current technology along with your people and processes. And then the tool also includes advisory time with our analyst team, and you can start to develop a roadmap of where you can improve, and also take a look at how you benchmark yourselves against industry peers and then across industry as well. And then finally, we actually do a select number of consulting projects per year where we'll actually come on site and sit on the same side of the table with you as you're looking to select a technology vendor and also develop a strategic roadmap and a game plan moving forward. So our research is independent, which means that we do no work for the vendors that we evaluate, nor do we speak at their conferences or advise them on their strategy. And so what that means for you is you're going to get a pull, no punches approach to where they're strong and where they're weak, along with best practices from studying these different marketplaces for the last 15 years, and perhaps more importantly, some pitfalls to avoid as you're looking to select a technology vendor. So the marketplaces that we cover are digital marketing, so areas such as web content management, digital marketing asset management, as well as campaign and lead management technology, along with digital workplace technology, such as collaboration, portals, etc. And so Tony today is going to walk us through how best to put that digital workplace toolkit together. So Tony, it's all yours.
Great, thanks, Scott. This is a topic really near and dear to our hearts. I would say this is one of the more, kind of common inquiries that we get from our subscribers is, yes, they have specific questions about specific vendors, and we ask them. They have questions about their own, internal operational effectiveness, and, we share some models around that. But there's also a lot of bigger questions, I think, are getting asked, especially in the past year or so, around a broader digital workplace toolkit. I think, there's all of these different types of systems that have to work really well together for your colleagues to be effective. Many of them are related to each other and overlap. Others are very distinct. And so the question becomes, okay, I can go kind of procure these things one at a time, but is there a broader picture here? And how do I create that broader picture, and how do I build this broader toolkit? And it's a really important and pressing question. And what's interesting about this, Scott, is that this world is changing, and some of the architectures are changing as well. And so today's session is going to give you hopefully some fresh ways of thinking about it. And specifically, I'm going to take a look at 4 topics. We think that these are the 4 keys of the digital workplace toolkit puzzle, if you will allow that, a little bit of a mixing metaphor there. But they're really 4 pieces of the puzzle. First, around architecture, making sure you got the right architecture. Second is usability, which is terribly important because now more than ever, your colleagues can opt out of these systems, go self-procure their own, or simply not use them. And so usability is a key consideration. And then effectiveness. And what's interesting is that nominally that's what these tool sets are supposed to do, yet very often when we talk to sometimes even the more savvier enterprises among our, around our subscriber base, sometimes effectiveness is the last filter that they're looking at, and really ideally it should almost be the first. And then finally, of course, value is always an important part of the equation. Some of these tools are very expensive but could deliver a high value. Other cases, they're very inexpensive and potentially deliver just what you need. And so it's really important to understand kind of where you fit on that spectrum, and I've got some ideas around that as well. So let's jump right into it, around architecture. I think that for a long time, many of us, particularly larger enterprises, have built these sort of estates, and sometimes people talk about it like a SharePoint estate, for example. It's like this big, chateau that we built with all these different rooms to do all these different things. And what I think we've learned over time is that from an employee perspective, if we're going to be agile in particular and meet changing and emerging needs, and sometimes having this big estate isn't really the right sort of architecture. So that then kind of begs the question, what's the follow-on to this sort of architecture? And I think the way you start answering that is to start thinking about what the digital workplace means. And so here's an example of just, some of the roadmaps that we worked through with some of our subscribers around things that were you found in a traditional kind of intranet setting. And some of these do have value, but they tend to be more kind of information repositories, often outside of context. So you have email groups, static manuals, static FAQs, these collections of websites around organizational sections. And really, when you look at survey after survey and just reams of anecdotal evidence out there, is that our colleagues, our employees, are really looking for services. They're looking to join true online communities. They want searchable knowledge bases of gold information, not the entire swath of old versions of Excel sheets. They want to do a lot more peer-to-peer sharing of information and savvy and skills rather than just consuming news. They want more role-based interfaces. In other words, they're really looking for a collection of services. And so the question is, given these various sort of dumping grounds that we have in our intranet and ERP landscapes, how do we get to this new digital workplace? And the reality is that very few of you are very far along this journey. We did some research earlier this year that suggested that nearly 2/3 of you are really still in kind of traditional intranet plus maybe social collaboration services, and that you have not yet begun to expand your scope to a more holistic digital workplace. And we certainly can understand why there's a lot of confusion over what digital workplace even means and how do you get there, and it can seem very daunting, and that's probably one of the reasons why you're on this webinar today. So part of this is also, I think, to reassure you that if you're feeling behind, you're certainly not alone here. I think we're all working our way towards this new future, but there's definitely a few clear milestones and placeholders that we can talk about as we go there. So one is, I think, in terms of architectures, I think there's a new appreciation for multi-vendor environments. So yeah, we still may have a major platform that anchors, sometimes the way you have an anchor store in a mall, but that mall is getting bigger and bigger, and there's more and more boutique stores there. And so, yeah, maybe you're locked into, Google at work, or many of you with SharePoint or Office 365 is kind of a major platform, but the scope of what that does in a digital workplace, in many cases, isn't always the scope of what they're doing is in many cases shrinking. And so we're beginning to see greater attention, I think, towards building architectures that support more multiple vendors that are involved more around services oriented, particularly microservices. And to some extent, even Microsoft has anticipated that in terms of the way that they've structured certainly Office 365 as a somewhat motley collection of largely non-integrated services. So, already some big vendors are sort of going there. But I think that we're looking at a future where your digital workplace isn't just sort of SAP plus SharePoint, but it's a whole panoply of different things. So, and so from an architectural perspective, obviously, there's a lot of key considerations there. So, traditional enterprise architecture, which is boxes and arrows, certainly is still useful in this environment. Understanding infrastructure services, the technology platforms, the business services, understanding the appropriate access channels. So this kind of traditional reference enterprise architecture, is still important. The problem is that it's not sufficient for getting you, where you want to go. And so I'm not a fan of everything that Stephen Covey says, but I really like this particular quote, which is, treat your employees exactly as you want them to treat your best customers, which is really that we've learned a lot from customer digital and customer-focused digital, and we've learned to put the customer at the center of the digital experience. And I think that if we want to be successful in the digital workplace, we have to do the same thing with employees. We have to put employees at the center of our architecture. So we've developed this second reference model. We've had some really interesting conversations with many of our subscribers around this particular model, around rethinking the way that they do employee digital technology, or MTech. And this is an employee-centered digital workplace reference model. So we have a lot of research available on this that if you're a subscriber, you can find on our site. But the important thing here is really thinking about this in a series of concentric rings, and in particular the blue area, where we're distinguishing between the gray, the business platforms, the technology vendors, and the specific applications, and really the primacy of business owning these applications and driving the roadmaps around them, with the key elements being, have these made our employees more effective? Have we allowed them to grow? Have we made them more efficient? Have we made their work easier? And have we allowed them to be recognized when they do important or useful things? So this is kind of an employee-centered reference model. Like I said, there's a lot of different ways to do this. We've taken some organizations and done some stoplight analysis where the employees actually sort of rate how effective these tools are. And sometimes it can be very interesting what the outcome of those are. But I think that even more generally, I think this calls to question the role of a traditional sort of intranet team. That if you're thinking about digital workplace, really you have to take an outside-in approach. In other words, not from the system to the employee, but from the employee screens to the system. So really from screens backwards, or glass backwards, as you wish. And the good news is there's all kinds of methodologies we can take from external digital engagement around user experience in terms of employee user journeys, employee-centered design, employee design thinking. This requires a lot of workplace contextual inquiry. So what really, in terms of the digital workplace team, as you're building a toolkit, it's really important for that team to serve as a user experience advocate for all of the applications that your employees are using. And this is very much a mind shift, and it's been very interesting. We've been coaching some organizations through this change. Often requires different sorts of skill sets. Requires a relentless focus on usability. So usability is always an interesting question, but I'm curious if you want to answer in the questions tab and go to meeting, if you have a particular definition of usability that you like. So if you've just got a few words, like a 3 or 5 word definition, I'll invite you to type that into the questions tab of go to meeting here. It's always an interesting question. How do you define usability? We always want it, but what is it? So let's see if you want to type anything into the questions tab that how you would define usability. Would love to hear it from you. So let's see. Massimo is saying ease of use, right? So yeah, that certainly is. That's a great definition. The only question is sort of what does ease mean, right? And so, sometimes other people who see another one here or someone saying it's just naturally intuitive, right? And so then the question is, well, what does intuitive mean? I like Jason's, you said work as expected. That's a really good one. Ken is saying users can do what they want without having to think about it. So that's really interesting too, and I think there's a lot of truth to that. That comes out of the consumer space as well. Of course, we do want employees to sometimes think a little bit, but I think you're right, Ken, that you're getting to the point of it. In fact, the definition that I've always really liked came from a book by Steve Krug that was called Don't Make Me Think. And his definition of usability was fitness to purpose. Fitness to purpose. So the question is, then at that point, what are the purposes? What are people trying to do? And in some cases, their purposes could be really complex, and so maybe it's a complex interface. But in other cases, they may need to do things very simply and very rapidly, in which case potentially it's a simple interface. So usability becomes very contextual, and it really gets us thinking then about what is necessarily what is the employee trying to read and what are we trying to get them to read, but what are they trying to do? And so in the digital workplace, when you're building a toolkit, we really say focus on applications rather than sites and features, news, content. It's not that information is unimportant. Information is terribly important. But the question is, in what context is that information actually being delivered and consumed in an environment where employees have choices about how they pay attention? So fitness to purpose and really understanding those purposes and what fitness means is really critical. And the good news, again, is that we have all sorts of different methodologies for understanding this and applying these lessons in an employee context. It's just that we haven't always had the discipline to do that. So then, if you're thinking about purposes, then we're kind of getting into a conversation of usefulness, right? And we see this a lot in just the social collaboration space. And I would argue that doing social collaboration right is kind of table stakes for the next digital workplace. In other words, if you're going to have employee-centered digital workplace, and employees are fundamentally as humans, we are social creatures, and we want to work together. We need to work together. So this is really table stakes. The problem is that we have this gap where at an executive level, you have aspirational desires around, hey, we just need to collaborate more, bust silos. But at a staff level, at the coalface, people have very instrumental concerns. Really, oftentimes, they just need the right answers. They don't know where to find those answers, but they need the right answers. And just searching the Intranet, how often does that get them there? Well, probably pretty rarely. Anyway, the idea here is that we need to close this gap, and what we'd argue is that business applications close these gaps. So here's some examples of 11 canonical business applications that we use when we're evaluating social collaboration tools. Now, it doesn't mean that every one of these is a high priority for you, or even necessarily germane in your particular enterprise, but the point here is that we're not talking about bulletin boards or forums or instant messaging or file sharing. What we're talking about is actual business applications that make people more effective at work. And so, first of all, these are just almost by definition bound to be more usable because they're making people more effective, but also they're going to drive greater business value. And this is for social collaboration. There's a whole set of business applications around enterprise portals, certainly ECM, and web content management, and almost any other technology that you would think of as part of a services-oriented digital workplace. So the key thing is really to have the team focusing on what are the applications that are going to drive value, and really focusing and building my toolkit around those applications, not around features and not around vendors, but around applications. And this is, by the way, how we've centered a lot of our own evaluation research. So this is our evaluation of Microsoft Yammer across these different applications I just showed you on the previous slide. And it turns out that Yammer is a master of many trades, but it's pretty bad at most of them, unfortunately, with the exception of sort of enterprise-wide conversation and news, where we give it 2 out of a possible 4 here. And so, Yammer kind of gets you towards a couple of these applications, but it wasn't really purpose-built for it. And I think that's a lot of the frustration we see around Yammer is, yeah, it's a single platform where many people can hang out, but it's not particularly elaborated in terms of the actual business applications. This puts a lot of pressure on community managers and others to kind of teach people to use Yammer a particular way, as opposed to Yammer naturally delivering on some of these on some of these promises. So it's also a useful way when you're actually sort of looking at the vendors and where are they strong and where are they weak. It's less about features and more around these sorts of scenarios. So we've been talking about usability and to some extent effectiveness, and we start out talking about architecture, but I think one of the things that's really important to do, whether you're starting on this journey or you're already well into this journey, whether you're selecting tools or you've already selected some tools, is really to understand, how effective are we? Really asking that question in a really sort of honest way. And by honest way, I think then by definition we have to start talking about data, and specifically benchmarking. So I'll invite you to try out this particular application that we have. It's a freemium model, so you can try it out for free, and then there's a paid version where you get some more goodies out of it. But the idea here is that it allows you to benchmark against competitors and people at large, and then help you visualize where you need to go. So the idea here is, okay, let's at least get started with giving yourself, by scoring yourself. And what's fascinating about this exercise is we've done this through dozens of different digital workplace teams over the past year, is quite honestly how low people are scoring. And that's not a bad thing, right? First of all, we set pretty high bars on some of this, but secondly, it allows you to really understand, okay, well, we do have some gaps here. Now we can have more concrete discussions around closing gaps, as opposed to saying, we have Yammer out there, why is only 5% of our customer base actually using it, right? That's an interesting question, but the goal here is not so much to use Yammer, but to be more effective at social collaboration. And so this gives you, the opportunity to start measuring yourself, and in particular across, different sorts of dimensions, like including key so-called soft issues like governance and program management, operations, and certainly analytics and optimization, very critical. But then ultimately it comes down to, do we have the right vendors, and are we getting the right value out of them, and what other vendors could we get value from? And as you know, these can be a very dizzying set of choices, and so it comes down to then, how do we narrow down these sets of choices that we have? And I'll just remind you, we're going to finish here in less than 5 minutes, and if you have any other questions, feel free to use the questions tab in the GoToMeeting control panel. Let's talk about vendor selection. I mean, here's a traditional way of doing it. This is our kind of joke here about the mystical quadrant. I founded Real Story Group 15 years ago as, honestly, as kind of an antidote to this sort of thinking. The idea being that, first of all, you need to cover more vendors. Secondly, you need to cover them much more critically. And third, you need to cover them with more technical depth. And fourth, and maybe most importantly, you need to understand their strengths and weaknesses in the context of what you need, as opposed to what some generic analyst rating is. And so, how do you go about doing that? One thing I'll invite you to try is what we call our Real Quadrant tool, where you can take the same research with the same vendors, change some of the preferences, and you end up with different winners and losers. So here's a couple of Real Quadrants in the portal marketplace. They're the same vendors, but very different sorts of results. So how is that? Well, it turns out in the first use case, we were really focusing on internal collaboration as a key application and lower total cost of ownership. In other words, we didn't have a big budget. In the second use case, we were more focused on business intelligence and dashboards, and we were focused in particular on a professional services channel, because we knew we were going to need a lot of help actually implementing this tool. So we weighted these things differently and came up with a different set of vendors. And what's interesting is that SAP Portal is in kind of the winners quadrant in one, and definitely in the losers quadrant in the other. And that's a totally legitimate result, based not on the vendor, but based on you, what's important for you. So as you build your toolkit, you really want to first understand yourself, but also understand what are your priorities and what are the things that matter to you more. And then that can drive your exploration of the marketplace. Obviously, we're big fans of research because that's how we make a living. But the process here is, obviously research helps you get started out, but then you want to go through a more agile selection process that really includes getting hands-on a lot sooner. So we have a particular methodology that you can see in several of our other webinars around this particular agile approach to selecting technology, which is very empirical, very iterative, very team-based, all the sorts of things that you would think about with respect to agile, but the most important being that to make sure that you have a hands-on bake-off before you bring any technology into the enterprise. We have a lot of interesting ideas around how to do those bake-offs effectively, how long they should be, all those sorts of things, and certainly welcome any questions you have along that way. But the key thing here is to follow a very iterative kind of hands-on process. All the more so because, these are your colleagues, these are your employees. You want them to be able to adapt the tools. You want them to really embrace them. You want them to be easy to use for them, which of course means, is it fit for their purposes? And the only way to find that out is to really test it against different sorts of scenarios. So again, the 4 pieces of the puzzle I encourage you to think about: architecture, including kind of evolving services-oriented architecture; usability, fitness to purpose; effectiveness, which is really around driving business value through applications; and then finally value, and really the right fit in terms of vendor being the right fit for you. Not the right fit for somebody else, but the right fit for you. So if you can master those 4 things, then I think you can build the right digital workplace toolkit. And if there's any way that Real Story Group can help you be more effective, both as a professional and as a team within your enterprise, please feel free to reach out, and Scott will join you here in a minute to explain how you can do that. Here's just some quick links to some of the things I talked about: the benchmarking, the Real Quadrant, any research excerpt that you'd like to get to sample some of our vendor evaluations, like the Yammer evaluation you saw. We have this fun vendor map in the background here. You can get that as well from our site. So with that, I'll invite you again to ask any questions. There's a few coming in, but I'll invite some more. And Scott, maybe you can just talk really quickly around next steps while I see some of these questions here.
Absolutely. Thanks, Tony. That was great to hear a little bit more about the digital workplace and really the best way to put that together and how those different technology products work with each other. As a quick reminder, the slides from the presentation will be sent to all the attendees. And in the past, we've had several folks that have come up to us in conferences or sent us emails that are wondering if they are, in fact, already subscribers to the research. So we certainly invite you to reach out to us to see if your organization has a subscription to our research. And if not, we'd certainly welcome the opportunity to talk with you more about what that entails. And we can even take you on a brief behind-the-scenes tour of the Real Story Group subscriber experience, so we can actually show how the Real Quadrant works, along with the Real Score effectiveness tool, to really get an idea of how effective your organization is, and then benchmark yourselves against your industry peers. Our next webinar will be January 4th, where my colleague Jared Jingles will walk us through our predictions for digital technology marketplace in 2017. In the meantime, as Tony mentioned, please don't hesitate to reach out to us at explore@realstorygroup.com, as we'd be happy to talk with you more about becoming a subscriber. With that, looks like there are some questions, Tony.
Yeah, thanks, Scott. A number of good questions have come in. Mike is asking, do we examine vendors as a whole or as individual products? And we really do both. So we look at the individual products and the technology, but we also look at, in many cases, some of the sibling tools that the vendor may or may not be cross-selling you. And we also, about half of our research is based around what we call strategic considerations. So that's one of the axes, in fact, in the Real Quadrant, which is things like the strength of the ecosystem, the quality of the customer support, which is really just how bad is the customer support, but and cost and value, technical modernity, and technical debt, huge issues that we look at. So there's obviously, Mike, as you're sort of hinting at here, there's a lot of pieces to this, to this puzzle. Let's see. Jason is asking, are there any recommendations to measure the ROI, i.e. effectiveness of a digital workplace? It's a great question, Jason. We get asked it quite a bit, and I've got a couple of answers. So one is, yeah, there's ways to measure ROI, but you have to be very they tend to be more kind of time and motion studies. A lot of it is around productivity improvements. I would argue that that's a fairly limited way to do it. And that, a number of the benefits actually are in terms of other more intangible enhancements, including ultimately improving your marketing and sales effectiveness, although not necessarily always in ways that are, immediately measurable. Many organizations are getting better about scooping up and accumulating anecdotes and extrapolating from there. I think the other approach to this too is really as a cost of doing business, that At one point there was the ROI of putting a phone on everybody's desk, and then was there the ROI of putting a computer on everybody's desk? There's definitely, sometimes these aren't easily measured. What's the ROI of having an actual physical headquarters? It's hard to say. Maybe it's actually pretty low. And so for many knowledge workers, their workplace is the digital workplace. So is it going to be good or not? I think this is a really fundamental strategic question to ask. Having said that, clearly measurement does come up. We like to engage HR in this because they have many sophisticated ways built up over decades around measuring employee morale and effectiveness and the effectiveness of their tools and systems. And so when we've seen this best, we've seen digital workplace teams partner with HR to come up with longitudinal studies and show how some of these proper investments have really moved the needle. So Joel's asking a great question around best of breed. Doesn't it take you down the old road of building silos and making integration difficult or impossible? And in theory, Joel, yes, it does, and that's part of the challenge that we've always had here. I think that the reason why people are at least opening themselves up to the possibility of this more is that what they're getting even with their own vendors, including even like Office 365, is silos and difficult integration. It's like, well, all right, if I'm having silos and difficult integration with a single vendor, and I'm not always getting optimal solutions from that vendor, maybe I should get more optimal solutions, and maybe my role in this future is going to be around, my IT team is going to focus primarily on integration. That's going to be my major challenge, but at least I'll be working with the right tool sets. So, I'm not suggesting that you necessarily go all in on all best of breed approach. What I'm suggesting is that there are certain key applications that are going to drive extreme business value, and that you should not, hoist yourself on the petard of consolidation in those cases. For applications that are not core to driving business value in the employee workplace, then yeah, maybe you can collectively put those together into single platforms. So, there's no simple one or the other. It's just that I think that the pendulum definitely swung towards a single platform, and now it's swinging back a little bit away from that, I believe for some very good reasons. Ken's asking a really great question as well about how much weight do you place on incumbency. And so we already have SharePoint and presumably Yammer. We already have Salesforce and presumably Chatter. And you have to put some weight on that, and I think this kind of relates a little bit to Joel's question, which is, okay, you have these tools, so you have to give them a chance to succeed. I think that, again, if you look at it from a vendor perspective and a capabilities perspective, in theory, Yammer and Chatter can check boxes. I think if you start looking at it from an application perspective, though, I think that's where you have to really kind of line them up. And if you go through a proper selection process where maybe you have Salesforce, Chatter, as well as some, and SharePoint and Yammer, as well as some other alternatives, and do the proper use case scenario-based selection process that we're urging, that question may get answered for you, that what you have is good enough, but maybe it's not. And then you've got to make some really difficult choices, but potentially the right choices for from looking at this from the screen backwards, or from the employee at the center rather than the enterprise at the center. The enterprise is at the center of this equation, then of course you always use what you have as an incumbent platform, because that makes your life easier. But if you're looking at it from the employee at the center, then hopefully that drives a different set of considerations. And if Chatter or Yammer win, it's because they deserve to win, and not just because you had them lying around. Okay, folks, we've run over a little bit, but certainly was delightful joining you for 35 minutes today. I want to wish you a great rest of your year. Really looking forward to re-engaging in January. If you have any end-of-year give in your budgets, we'd certainly like to talk to you about how we can make you more effective in 2017. So feel free to reach out to us. In the meantime, best wishes for you, and we'll catch up again next year. For Real Story Group and Scott Dill, this is Tony Byrne signing off. So long now.